Okay.
All right. Um, Hi, everybody, and welcome back to the Popular Music Books in Process series, a joint project of the International Association for the Study of Popular Music US chapter, the Journal of Popular Music Studies, and the Pop Conference. I'm Elena Razlogova, one of the series organizers, along with Eric Weisberg, Carl Wilson, Gus Stadler, and Alex VC. Stepping back for now are Francesca Royster, Antonio Randolph, and Kimberly Mack, but we look forward to them rejoining in the future. You can find our whole calendar on the IASPM website under the Journal tab, and you can also catch up on videos of all our past sessions on Eric's YouTube channel, including last week's session with Franz Nicolai and Stephen Hayden about band people, support musicians, and their view on labor and democracy in indie and pop bands. We're off next week, but then return on October 29 at 5:30 p.m. Eastern with Ann Powers discussing a new collection, How Women Made Music, a revolutionary history from NPR Music, with several other contributors to the volume. Today, it's time to talk about music writing. Historicizing the Village Voice music section with The Freaks Came Out to Write, a New Oral History by Tricia Romano. We're excited to have her here in conversation with Michaelangelo Matos. Let me give you some quick background on today's presenters. Tricia Romano began her 8-year career at the Village Voice as an intern. As a contributing writer, she wrote features and award-winning cover stories about culture and music. Her reported column, Fly Life, gave a glimpse into the underbelly of New York nightlife. She has been a staff writer at the Seattle Times and served as the editor-in-chief of The Stranger, Seattle's alternative news weekly. A fellow at MacDowell, UCross, and Millay artist residencies, her work has been published in the New York Times, Rolling Stone, The Daily Beast, Men's Journal, Elle, Alto Journal, and the Los Angeles Times, among others. She lives in Seattle, Washington. The Freaks Came Out to Write is her first book. Michaelangelo Matos is the author of 3 books, including most recently, Can't Slow Down, How 1984 Became Pop's Blockbuster Year. He writes Beat Connection, a DJ Mixes newsletter on Substack, plays music every month for Particle FM, an excellent radio station, and lives in St. Paul. During their conversation, please post your questions as you think of them in the chat, and also comments if you want. In the last part of the session, Eric will call on you to unmute and ask them during the Q&A. And of course, we also encourage you to use the chats for any comments. However, we'll ask the presenters to ignore the chat, and the comments, and we'll send them a copy of the chat transcript later, so they won't miss anything. And now I'm happy to turn things over to Tricia and Michaelangelo.
Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you.
And I'm going to start with some opening remarks. I first read The Village Voice in early 1990, right around the time I turned 15. It was the Paz and Jop issue with De La Soul on the cover. And it featured an essay from someone who refused to vote in the poll and about the reasons why. The music section lead was Nelson George on Lisa Stansfield. There were so many albums and singles listed in the poll, and I was hooked. I started looking at old polls at the library. The music section for me, and I think for many others, was the Voice's Trojan horse. Soon you were reading all of it. I had met Tricia Romano shortly before she moved to New York, where she would soon land in the Voice's fact-checking department. And when I moved there a little under 2 years later, we became friends, and I was one of her nightclub crew while she was covering it for the paper every week. She introduced me to Chuck Eddy, then the music editor, and that got me into the paper in 2001. Off and on, I contributed to The Voice through 2018, when the website shut down a year after its print edition went under. The week they announced the print paper was ending, Tricia went to New York for a Voice reunion party. She saw people from the paper's earliest days, Ed Fancher, Jules Feiffer, Jonas Mekas. She called me shortly afterward and told me with a kind of alarm and clarity that I recognized in my own moments of realization that somebody had to write their story, its story, The Voices. It had to be her because she had the idea. I'll never forget my response. Tricia, if you don't write this book, I'm going to fly out there and kick your ass. I also promised to help, which came in the form of edits, editorial advice, leads on secondary sources, and the sorry but stern no that her overabundance of amazing material required. The Freaks came out to write covers a gargantuan amount of The Voice's history without getting near all of it, and that's true even in microcosm with regard to the paper's music coverage. Publishing weekly for over 60 years, as well as on a consistently updated website for 20, in the most musically active city in America, means a lot goes undiscussed in Tricia's book. Some of that will come here, and the participant Q&As are open to some of the other writers and editors and bands and venues and scenes that also played big roles in The Voice's history. But anyway, my best friend wrote the book of the year, and I couldn't be prouder. Here she is to take my and your questions. Tricia Romano, thank you for doing this.
Thank you, Matos.
All right. When did you first encounter the voice music section in particular? Did you read it before you read the rest of the paper, and did you want to write for it immediately?
Um, my earliest memory of The Voice probably comes when I moved to Seattle in 93. And I remember going to Broadway, this main drag over here, a few blocks away from where I live now. And there was a newsstand there called Bulldog News. And they had the Voice, which you could buy. I think it had not yet gone free in New York, but you could buy it in Seattle. And I remember getting it and thinking it was the coolest thing ever. And, this is 93, 94. So the whole like grunge situation was happening. And so I was very interested in that. And I recall reading Ann Powers in the paper around then. And I remember, some 90s names like Touré. I remember Cy Michael, who's a friend of mine now. That was probably my introduction to The Voice and to the music section. Growing up, I had always read Spin and Rolling Stone, but I lived in Las Vegas and New Jersey, so and in a very anti-intellectual environment and an anti-countercultural environment. So those were like my biggest introductions to music writing. And later I find out that, of course, all of those people that write for Spin and Rolling Stone, most of them worked for The Voice first.
Right. Yeah, exactly. So Nat Hantoff didn't write about jazz for The Voice, but what do you think he brought in, having been a jazz writer, that informed his other work there?
Well, I think we talk about this in the book where his daughter talks about it, I believe. And it's that, jazz was predominantly Black music form, and he was very attuned to civil rights. And that is what that was the thread for him from jazz to what he covered at The Voice. And he wrote about it, but First Amendment and civil rights stuff through that lens. And he would often use, I think one of the chapters I use, he's talking about a jazz musician. That was how he opened it, and it was to illustrate the civil rights problems that were happening in the 60s. But he did, I think, occasionally write some jazz, but I think that was his thing. He wanted to get out of doing that because he was so well known for doing it. And when he walked into the Voice's office, he says, I'll write you for free, but I don't want to write about jazz.
Can you tell us about your first ever meeting with Richard Goldstein?
I don't remember if I remember the exact meeting, but I remember that when I applied to be an intern, I got paired with Frank Owen very quickly. And Frank Owen was a British reporter who covered nightlife and dance music, but he was more of a reporter than a critic. And my friend Catherine McGrath, who was at the school paper with me, she got an offer to be the full-time intern for Richard Goldstein. And so it was a bigger job, and I was a bit jealous. But I remember he was a tough one to work for because he really had you looking up stuff and reporting and fact checking and interviewing. Like he really had like a real job working for him. But his, when I was there young, I didn't really understand who a lot of these people were and the context, but their background. Like I didn't know Richard was like the first rock critic, or is considered to be the first rock critic. I had no idea. It was like he was just fun guy running around, he was just a big boss at that point too. He was, the executive editor, and I was, 25.
Right. Um, do you have a particular favorite instance of what is apparently a legendarily bad memory of his, or his bad
Um,
memory?
well, I learned about it interviewing him, and he would tell me, straight up that I have a terrible memory. You should fact check me. Everything I'm saying, you should fact check. And one of the things that he was saying he should fact check was the Beatles. When the Beatles came out, and he said that basically he learned that he was wrong about a bunch of stuff is because Bob would call him when he was writing his memoir, and Richard had gotten a lot of stuff wrong. But he's in the book he tells this story about for some reason I have a black screen. He tells this story about Karen Finley, going to see the performance artist Karen Finley, and he's recalling the performance, and the performance is called I think Yams Up My Granny's Ass, and she uses canned yams and she's kind of smearing them around her, but Richard is recalling it as being like she's kind of pushing yams out of her vagina. Like, and this is like something that just didn't happen. It just did not happen. um so it just in the book, like I don't correct him because that's a bit what an oral history is. It's people's memories, and you can have people with conflicting memories. So
By the way, out of all the people you interviewed for the book, who did the best Bob Christgau impersonation?
oh, first of all, anytime you talk to anybody about Bob, they all, when they're, trying to tell a story about Bob, they all do the Bob impersonation, every single person without fail. But I have to say, Joe Levy's was probably the best.
What makes it the best?
I don't know, just the accuracy of it. It's
Good
good.
enough. What was your sense of the Voice's relationship with disco in the 70s? Did they cover it extensively at all?
Well, I mean, my understanding is that Vince Aletti was the disco writer, which is funny because at one point I was writing my nightlife column, and in the early 2000s, and Vince for me at that point was the art guy. He was a visual art editor, and I had literally no idea that he was the disco person from the 70s.
The
And
first ever to write about disco
yeah,
as a
yeah,
phenomenon.
yeah, yes. And so he was doing that, I believe, at I want to say Billboard, but I can't remember exactly. And then Bob had him he allowed him to do some stuff in The Voice. But he's one of the people that I didn't get to put as much into the book because, as much as I really wanted him to tell the story about going to the loft for the first time, and he did tell me a lot of these stories, um, I had to sort of curb to some degree the amount of music stuff that I had because I had so much of it. And it was like there were other sections and there were other decades and there were other topics that I had to cover. I mean, I could have very easily added like 3 or 4 more chapters on music, just and Vince's stuff, could have been its own world.
Right. Well, if I'm remembering this correctly, in the original draft, the 70s was around 300 pages long and the 80s was around 400 pages. Is that wrong?
I don't go by pages, I go by word count, but I do know that the 80s was 100,000 words. And, that my book was supposed to be 135,000 words,
Right.
which was hilarious.
And
And
undoable.
an undoable thing. I was like, yeah, that's adorable. It's not going to happen. And I think it ended up being about 170, which is, it's enormous. It's like it's too big. So the 100,000 word 80s section was, I think you and I were talking about this. Like maybe I should just make the whole book about just the 80s, and it could have very easily done that. But I really felt like I needed to show the whole arc. And what made it hard was the 80s, and all the music coverage and hip hop coverage that came through. I really felt like it was super important because it was also so intertwined in what was going on with, Central Park 5 and, all the other things that were happening in the 80s. And a lot of the Black writers that came through during the 80s in the music section managed to really make their way through the rest of the paper in a very significant way and help cover that, more social justice stuff.
Yeah, and that's also in the lineage of the voice in general. Another thing that you talk about extensively in the book is how fluid it was from one section to another for the writers
Yeah.
and the editors sometimes.
I think it's really pretty unusual. If you go to the New York Times, for instance, as a staff writer or even a freelancer, I think it's pretty hard to move between sections. Um, they assign you and that's where you are for a while. And I think at The Voice, especially probably pre-90s, I think that was a lot more fluid. It was more open, it was the open newspaper, as they say, and they were more interested in new voices and discovering new voices. And that was a real boon for a lot of the younger Black writers that were coming through, any of the young writers. Also, don't forget internship programs in that era were unpaid and very exploitive, and that meant lots and lots of people could come through the doors. And that meant an influx of new voices and new blood all the time. It started to be more gatekept, I think, in the 90s and 2000s.
You said it could have been three or four more chapters about music. What would they have been?
Well, I think I would have loved to do more on Vince and that era. And then there is a very funny chapter with RJ on the call. I don't know if RJ's on the call, but RJ Smith had a very funny incident where he got stranded on a pirate radio on a boat that was blasting a pirate radio off the waters of the Hudson, and he got arrested by the FBI with them, even though he had like a press pass and thrown in jail. And it was just, a very funny story that's very Village Voice, like just doesn't really happen anywhere else, kind of thing. And it was just one of those things where we had so much to cut that it wasn't. It was charming and it was funny, but it wasn't necessarily like integral to the coverage of the music section. So there was that, and then there was a whole section that I had about women in the late 80s and early 90s, and that included Evelyn McDonnell and Anne and Donna Gaines, and it just didn't have a shape that my editor was happy with, my agent was happy with, and again we had like a lot of ground to cover and too much material. So that ended up getting tossed. And also by that point, like by the time I get to the 90s, I had spent quite a bit of time on music and in various forms. And so I felt like I had to, I think at that point I did the art section and film, the MTV, the indie film that Amy Taubin covered. Yeah. Yeah.
Let's talk about 7 days. There was actually a chapter, my favorite chapter, maybe my favorite chapter that had to be cut from the book was
Yep.
about this publication called 7 Days. It was a sister
Mhm.
voice of the sister publication of The Voice in the late 70s. What was it and how did it affect The Voice?
So I guess towards 89, 88, 89, they decided that they wanted to have more listings. And they wanted, like, Leonard Stern was the owner at the time, and Leonard Stern is like the pet magnet, billionaire guy. And he wanted the Voices listings to be like super comprehensive. He wanted everything. And so it was sort of a smarter Time Out, a kind of a combo between Time Out and New York Magazine. And it had its own staff and its own like group. And the thing that was also interesting is that they were not unionized because it was a completely different paper. So that kind of created some tension between the two publications. And even though a lot of the people knew each other or were friends with each other, there's this idea that like there was a moment when people thought that Leonard really wanted to get rid of the Voice because it was so difficult in terms of the union and dealing with that, how large it was, and just make it about 7 days. At 7 days, I think was around a year and a half. It won a national magazine award, and then it folded. I believe Joe Levy was part of 7 days at some point, and I know Peter Sheldall was. It was like a very smart time out, right? But they didn't make enough money. It was probably not uptown enough for the uptown people to pick it up. And so Leonard just shut it down. And Leonard Stern is very, very, he doesn't, he's very decisive about his business decisions. One of the most shocking stories he told me was that the second somebody showed him the numbers from Craigslist, like what would happen if all of the apartment ads went away, he just made the decision to sell the paper that afternoon. Like, it was super fast. So 7 days didn't last because of that. And a lot of people have a lot of fondness for it. It's very hard to see copies of it. Yeah.
Wow. Now, music-wise, the big story of the 70s was punk and the big story of the 80s was hip hop. What was the challenge in framing these two very heavily written about eras?
I guess for me, it was just to tell it from the viewpoint of the paper rather than the viewpoint of like the larger phenomenon. Like what was James Wolcott's experience? How did he end up going there? Like, why was he going there all the time? What does he remember about it? And also the advertising. Like, one of the first people I met when at that party, the reunion party, was this woman named Jackie, and she worked in the advertising department. She told me that she took the first ad for CBGBs, and I was like, oh, that's really interesting. And those two
That's a
things were
pivotal
happening.
moment.
Yeah, those two things were happening at the same time. Where the advertising in the back was very, very it was exploding, and then the coverage inside the paper was mirroring that and getting bigger. And that also happens when Bob takes over the paper, Robert Christgau. And that line, I think, is it Joe Levy or David Herndon says something to me in the 80s about the like line between what they were covering and them, and the paper was just gone, right? Like it was just like they'd go see She's Got a Habit and then get on the subway, and the actress Spike Lee's sister would be on the subway car right in front of them. So there was just like no hard line between what you were writing about and the culture. And I think that was true, very true in the music section, especially, compared to other papers and at the time, James Wolcott went there every single night, and then and saw it, and then to CBGB, and then Nelson George is like helping fund a Spike Lee movie, and then coming back and writing about stuff related to that. So it was all just of a piece, and that's where The Voice had a leg up on the more traditional so-called objective newspapers. Like it made them better because they were really there. They were right on the ground with what was happening. And so the advertising in the 70s and 80s, and those music ads in the back where, musicians are posting like looking for a drummer, no Junior Ginger Bakers. And it's the same, like it's a symbiotic relationship. Like they weren't posting those ads in the New York Times.
Right. I mean, you cite the stories of Blondie and of Max Wein. You get great quotes from Max Weinberg about joining Springsteen's band after The Voice. I know that Kiss formed after putting
Another one.
together a Voice ad.
And what was the other one that we saw?
I was just about to say the Steely Dan.
Yeah.
This guy on the Substack called Expanding Dan found the actual ad that got Becker and Fagan hired into, I believe it was Denny Diaz's band, and which is the nucleus of Steely Dan. So anyway, but it's a great angle. Now I'm curious, where in what Nelson George memorably refers to on page 353 as Chris Gow's Warren of Records. Did you interview him and Carol DeBell?
Oh, I was in the kitchen with them. I was in the kitchen. And then, I took some photos and video of Bob in his infamous office with like the towering records and papers, and you're sitting really, really low to the floor. And it's like, I think it was still an MS-DOS. And I believe that's where he edited me, was in that. But I
Tell
only
us
had
about
one
this. When did he edit you?
Only one Bob Scow edit, and I'll never forget it as long as I live. I always felt, incredibly stupid around Bob because I'm, not like this great mind. But I did a column called Flylight, which was, even, sillier than anything you could think of. It was about nightclubs, and I remember this column was about the Misshapes, which was a DJ trio from New Jersey. They had moved from New Jersey and kind of taken the little club world by storm. And they were like basically ushering that whole like celebrity DJ trend where like they would get Jarvis Cocker from Pulp to come in and play his favorite records, and Carlos D from Interpol, and all those people. And I think they had Boy George, and at one point they had Madonna. But this was like the first one or two columns on them, and it was a 750-word column, and I think Vince was out of town and Bob took over, and I was like, I'm going to die. And I went over to his house, and I was like kind of like embarrassed that this is what he was editing, not one of my big features or something. But he was like, there were jokes that I was trying to make, and he made them funnier, and he cut like about 100 words out without losing a single piece of real material, and it was so great. But the thing that would make me crazy is that sometimes he'd be like, I need you to come up with another word or like another phrase, like rewrite the phrase in front of him. Like, I'm like, Bob, I can't do this, but you like looming over my shoulder. Go away.
Hopping his leg. When that's funny because I hadn't realized this until you said that. That's actually some of that. I quoted that in my book. I quoted that in The Underground is Massive, that actual piece. So that's That's funny. Over the years you worked at The Voice, how did you see the music section shifting in terms of its visibility, page count, focus, etc.?
I mean, I was there during like the worst period, right? Like it was when New Times took over. And I think Chuck was the editor when I first got there. And then, he was more of like a traditional voice editor where it was, long form criticism and whatnot. And then when New Times took over, they were very big. They fired Chuck and they put in Rob Harvilla, who everyone was like ready to hate, but Rob Harvilla is a great person and legit and all of that. You can read about that in the book. There's a whole thing about that. But New Times's edict was they wanted you to be on the ground and reporting because they didn't think criticism was reporting, which I know Eric will very, very strongly rebuke. And because their idea of reporting is like you stick a mic in somebody's face and you see it with your eyes and that's what happens, like instead of anyways, they were just very simplistic, but that meant I was in a good position because that's just what I did. That was what the column was, going out every night and writing about what I saw. But I feel like while I was there, that was when the internet was more prominent and Gawker was more prominent, all of that. And we had, the ability to see who was reading, how many people were reading what. And I remember my column was really heavily read. But I couldn't get a sense of like if the music section it was being read by the like I felt like in the 70s and 80s from what people were telling me that the musicians, the DJs, the club owners, they were reading The Voice. They were like keeping tabs on it. I don't know that that was true in the 2000s in the same way. So but also at that time is when Gawker and all these other, blogs start coming up. And that's when I feel like the Voice's power starts to dissipate a little bit because for a while we were the like main thing. We were the only thing in town. And then, by the time I left, especially when New Times had taken over, Gawker was just basically using us as punching bag, you know, just like reporting like live as like all the meetings went downhill.
The thing that I remember, well, let's move to this question.
Okay.
I know that you had to leave an enormous amount out of the book, and that includes interviews with a number of significant music writers, some of whom are probably attending this chat. And I want to ask you about that a little bit. Before we do that, I want to cite something that I did an interview with Bob Scow for Red Bull Music Academy 9 years ago. And I asked him
Okay.
top of head for 5 pieces he'd edited at The Voice that he would include in an anthology of edited works there. So these are the ones he named. Tom Johnson on Plastic People of the Universe, 1978. Lester Bangs, The White Noise Supremacists, 79. John Picarella on the Feelies, I think 78. Greg Tate's first piece on Pharaoh Sanders, 81. Chuck
Hmm.
Eddy's Hasn't Job comments for 83, which were published in early 84. Now you've covered Tate and Bangs in the book, but it's an abundant music section for many years under many editors. So I want to ask, who were your favorite music-related interviews that you had to cut for space?
Well, I think we talked about that. Vince Aletti, and Anne, I believe were my two favorite. But I think it's more that there are just chunks of the interviews that just don't get touched. Like I talked to Eric for hours and we didn't make it in. I'm sorry. um and it was like nothing like personal or whatever, just like I think I've hit the wall on this one topic. And then you know with Joe, I know that he gave me a whole lot of material, and I wasn't able to include a lot of it. He's in it, you know. There was Michael Gonzalez was another person that I talked to for several hours, and he was great. And there was literally nothing wrong with the interviews, but at a certain point, I was like, I'm going to do my Bob impersonation when I started this book, and I told him what I was going to do. And he goes, Tricia, have you read Please Kill Me? Yes, Bob. There's only about 60, 70 people. Not that many people. Sorry, some people just aren't going to make it. That's like how I had to.
Well, it's perfect advice. That's perfect advice.
Oh,
there was,
I talked to Chuck Eddy for hours, and I don't think we really got to, do as much as I would have liked to. I think Chuck was in the original draft a lot longer. It was just it's just my editor already wanted to kill me. So
right. Well, there's one other name that I wanted to ask about that I know you had an extensive conversation with who might be a little more of an obscure name is Carmen Moore.
Oh yeah.
Can you tell us about Carmen Moore?
So Carmen Moore was like an early 60s music writer. And he was also an actual composer, Black. He was, I think, really the first Black writer at The Voice, and he was the only one for a long time. And I think when Bob came around and changed the music section's focus is when he was no longer really with paper, but he had like great stories about hanging out with like John Lennon and Yoko Ono and smoking weed at their house and like playing with them, and then like, or being backstage at like Stevie Wonder concert and like Andy Warhol coming up to him. He had all these like the color stories of like the 60s and 70s. And I just was not able to get them in because at a certain point, there's also like about timing, like when I was covering that like kind of funky 60s, 70s stuff, some of the things that he would mention, you actually pointed this out, some of the things that he was mentioning was later. And so it was out of sync with the time. Like I tried as much as possible to kind of stay within the timeline as I could. It's a little fuzzy, but so I didn't want to be referencing something later 70s, mid 70s, in the early mid 60s.
Well, that also points to something that you chose to do from the beginning, which is not have any interstitial narrative. That was a decision you made right at the start.
Yeah.
Can you talk about that?
No, I think I don't know. I think it's like it is a aesthetic choice. I really like oral histories to be very purist in that way, where there's just the voices of the people, and you can do a little cheat where you like quote yourself here and there. But I feel like it takes you out of the realm. Like it takes you out of that feeling of listening to people talk, and all of a sudden I come in and I do this like omniscient narrator thing. I think it's cheating in a weird way. I know that that's not true. Like, obviously some great oral histories out there that do this out of necessity or just stylistically. I've read oral histories where they do that, and I'm torn because sometimes what happens, and this is what I found happening, my editor really wanted me to have intros to every single thing and I was like, because she's like, I really like your writing, like you, because I did it for the proposal, and I was like, yeah, but I had to do that in the proposal because I didn't have like all the material yet. So I had to set up what I thought the chapter was going to be because I didn't have the material. And it's like, you didn't buy a book of writing or narrative writing, you bought an oral history from me. If you wanted me to write this, then we have to change the whole thing. Like it would have been a lot easier to write it. is the other thing. I think a lot of people think oral histories are just copying and pasting and just like so simple. And it's like, no, no,
No, not at all.
not
Now,
at all.
so I want to ask one final question. I think this is going to be the end of my line, but I mean, and I have an answer for it after yours, but do you have a favorite voice illustration or photo of a musical performer?
Well, not of a musical performer, but of a voice person. Michael Musto pretending to be Madonna in the Sex cover where he's like naked, like
I think that is the winner,
hitchhiking a
yes.
ride on, on the side of the road, which apparently was really done in the freezing cold in New Jersey by Catherine McGann. At one point, I almost wanted that to be the cover, and of course, they kiboshed that. So, yeah.
Yeah, that's quite I have my own answer, which ties into to the my friendship with the author. Tricia has been my best friend for years, and in 2006 I was briefly working in New York at a job that did not suit me, and we were hanging out, and one day we were, chatting on DM, and I'm quoting freely here, but Tricia basically was like, Matos, I have a dilemma. There are two things happening tonight, and one of them is going to be the column, and I'm not sure which one to choose. And one of them was some musical event that I no longer remember that is completely lost to history, because the other one was, if I'm remembering this correctly, it was a gay bar, and they had a waiter,
Mr.
and
Black.
it was Mr. Black, and he wore a jock strap and an apron and nothing else.
And a top hat.
And a top hat. And he was he was a waiter, and he was said to have the best ass in New York. And I said to her, Tricia, how is this even a question? It's obviously going to be the ass. And so
the
I
ass was people got their photos taken next to the ass, and it was like a whole thing, like Chloe Sevigny and like Boy George, all those people.
Yes. So we
interviewed the ass.
So we went to the ass that night, and there was this kind of like it wasn't a great photo, but it's my favorite ever, nightlife photo, I think, just for personal reasons. Anyway, I wanted to tell that story. Yes, that's one of my favorite ever Village
Bruce LaBruce, Bruce LaBruce, the gay filmmaker, Bruce LaBruce. That's one of his favorite columns as well. he was a big fan of that column.
Oh my God, that's amazing. So, if Eric is ready, I would love to see if we could throw it over to him.
I will do my best. I think that this format may not lend itself as much to the targeted question as the format of the book.
Okay.
But let me see what I can do and encourage others to send more questions, or just let me know via the chat that you'd like to make a comment, because I think there's room for that as well.
Absolutely, yes.
And I should probably make clear to those watching this who don't know me that I'm a former voice person myself. So sometimes I'll probably interject a little bit differently than I would in a other situation. Hard to avoid. In that vein, I think the first conversation should come from my successor as voice music editor, Chuck Eddy, who was also a contributor long before I was a contributor, and who raised as an important topic that we might want to linger on for a couple of minutes, the role of the Passenjap. What is Passenjap? What do we call
Passenjap Critics Poll?
For crying loud. Passenjap Critics Poll.
Comments.
Yeah. So
the comments.
Why don't you get us started? And I may throw in some comments back, and then Tricia, Michaelangelo, all of us, I think, can, and hopefully that'll stir the pot for some other folks too. And then I see a few more questions starting to form, which is good. So Chuck, take it away on Passenjap, and feel free not to just ask a question, but to make some serious comments.
Okay, I don't know how much serious what I have serious to say. By the way, hi Michaelangelo, hi Tricia, hi Eric. It's been a while.
Hello.
It's great to see all you guys.
You too.
You're-
I was
you're
actually
like very dark.
surprised. I was actually surprised, and the book's great. I mean, I love it. I finished it just a couple weeks ago, but I was kind of surprised there wasn't a separate chapter on Pazenjop.
Yeah.
And I wonder whether that was a conscious decision, because it just seems like that's a story in itself. Maybe
there
a book
was
in
more,
itself.
like there was more. But again, it was like, like, yeah. I mean, you're basically the one,
Well,
the discussion of Pazenjop was trimmed down, and it's just, yeah, it was
I mean,
longer.
my thing is in there, but I mean, it was around,
Yeah.
obviously. And then you mentioned this. It was around years before, I was anybody, and around for years after I left too, and obviously it was Bob's thing. I mean, I don't even know if it's even explained, to what extent it explains what exactly Pazenjop was. I mean, how
I mean,
all encompassing. I don't even know if there's
that's
any.
I mean, that's the thing. It's sort of like you crack open a door, and so I talked to Matos for a long time. Actually, you're one of the people that ended up getting cut, right?
By my own hand.
That, but there was a section in the New Times era where they fire Bob, and then Matos and Gawker do their kind of the Village Voice poll, and there was like a longer bit about that, and it just, again, it's like I could have done half the book on the music section, and I had to like scale it back, and also
can I make one suggestion, Trish? Rather than let's always come back to the need to cut things, why don't we use the time we have here to actually talk about the Pazenjop section a little bit for a couple of minutes, and then and I would urge that for other things. It doesn't have to be about why isn't this in the book. Chuck, why don't you tell viewers here, but also watching it on YouTube later, what was Pazenjop and what ultimately
I mean,
what was its importance to you?
There were music polls. Back to the jazz era. I don't even know what the first music, but and there were a couple that preceded directly Pazenjop. What Pazenjop was, for anybody watching who isn't familiar with it, it was a poll of the best albums and later the best singles of the year, starting, I believe, in 1971 or 72, and then it skipped a year or skipped a couple years, and then came back.
That's why they always had the title of the 67th or 60 or whatever, like the annual.
The weird name, which a lot of people hate, I think was based on a poll that was run in a magazine called Fusion, if I remember right, starting from maybe 68 to 70, 71. I mean, it's important to me because, honestly, the first time I saw the Village Voice, I mean, you guys talked about when you did. I was at University of Detroit. I was a freshman, and writing for the Varsity News. I was a journalism major. Had no interest, not only just in music criticism. I had very little interest in music, and I saw this cover where the headline was "The Triumph of the New Wave." And it had to do with the 1978 poll. There was also a piece on the cover about Jimmy Carter and a piece about Donald Trump in early 1979. And I think at that point, Bob Scow, who ran the poll, was sending ballots to, I don't know, it may have been 100 voters. And it just fascinated me. All these records that were being voted for, I had no idea what they were. And to me, it just kind of opened up the floodgates. And within months, I was writing music reviews myself at University of Detroit. Within a couple of years, I sent a letter to Bob. I mean, I think I invited myself to participate in the poll. The third year I participated in the poll was, I think, 1983. I sent a long letter, 11 pages, to Bob. He printed a bunch of it, and that started the whole trend, or the whole thing where he would print comments up for voters along with it. And the thing is, it wasn't just people who wrote for The Voice. The idea of Paz and
Right.
Jop was it was people who wrote about music, wrote music criticism all over the country. And eventually, I think by the time I left, and even more so after we left, people outside of the country. I mean, I think by the end there were
Mhm.
British voters or whatever. And I don't know that in any art form, any popular art form or high art form, there's an equivalent, um, just quantity wise, for a poll. I mean, is there a film poll that I mean,
I mean,
Yeah, there is.
there
There's
was
Sight
a
and
film
Sound.
with
poll.
that
The
many? I
Sight
mean,
and Sound poll goes back to
maybe some others.
1950.
Yeah.
The Sight and Sound poll goes back to 1952, but it only happens every 10 years. This Paz and Jop was very different because it's yearly.
But then, and I think The Voice did a film poll that, like, kind of, they started doing that. I mean, I think I don't know if The Voice's film poll was as comprehensive. Like, I felt like Bob was trying to get, I mean, pre-internet, you really have to think about how hard. And then Matos and I were part of the attempt to put these things online, the polls, so people could, like, vote online. I think we were all part of that.
That was actually, yeah,
And then
that was my,
hell,
that was me during my music editor
yeah, I like.
tenure.
It was hell, right? Like, I think the thing that Bob and Paz and Jop, it was all about being as comprehensive and I think as inclusive as you could. Like, that's like, I think that was his thing. He really wanted to know what everybody was thinking. And
Well,
I mean, and I think I don't remember, Eric, if or in Chuck, but I don't even know, did he require that you vote for somewhere regularly to vote in it, or like, what was the sort of.
I think you kind of defined yourself. I don't know whether there's any time where he said, "Wait a second, this guy's a ringer," he doesn't actually write. So
Uh-huh.
we're not going to count his ballot. I don't remember that ever happening. But I do know, as early as like 78, 79, he was pushing for, say, more Black participation,
Mhm.
more participation by women voters, more participation by people outside of New York. And
Mhm.
I think Paz and Jop probably. I mean, if The Voice wasn't like the center of music criticism already, Paz and Jop made it almost by
Mhm.
definition because people at every other publication were sending in their ballots.
Right.
We're voting and we're
Right. It was.
contributing. And I guess it's worth mentioning that Bob's essays, which were monstrosities in their own right, running gosh, 6,000 words. Like I'm not even sure what his word count usually was. I mean, they were a part of it as well.
Mhm.
The thing that I
Mhm.
would sort of throw out there, and then I think we should move it on to other questions, is what Paz and Jupp also did, and Chuck was sort of hinting at this, is it took the voice music section outside of the range of people in New York going to shows or mingling with artists. And for better or for worse, it made the voice music section much more of a section of people who wrote critical sentences. For both Anne and I, getting a short thing printed in the Paz and Jupp comments first led to being invited
Mhm.
to write longer
Well,
pieces. And
me
so,
too,
Mhm.
obviously.
yeah, and so
Same.
in an important way, I think there is a tension between the side of the voice music section that is about critics in their homes having thoughts about albums and writing sentences about them, and these sort of writer slash personalities on the scene, which was certainly the other strong element of the voice in general. And the fight between those things is an interesting aspect, I think, of the longer voice story. Let me, Chuck, we may come back to you, and I'll
Eric, can I
definitely,
just say, because that
yeah,
connects right into the other comment I put up there, the tension between The Voice being a national paper or a New York paper,
yeah,
no.
no, that's the thing I want to come back to later, but I
Okay.
want to just get some other people in. Elena, why don't you ask your question now, and then we'll go to some others.
Okay, I will try to be quick. So maybe the answer is just a simple no, but I was wondering what was Village Voice's relationship with less mainstream music press. I know East Village Other comes up on 2 pages as a competitor in the late 60s. But were there any music zines or smaller specialized music magazines on the Village Voice writers' radar, music radars specifically, in the 70s and 80s, like New York Rocker, Right On, Word Up for Rap, Jersey Beat, Ear Magazine for New Music? And was there any, like, did people move up from these little magazines up to Village Voice or not?
So I can't speak to this, directly, but I know that the Soho Weekly News was a pipeline for a lot of voice writers.
Yes.
I think like Karen, I want to say Karen Durbin and Amy Taubin and Michael Musto all started there. I don't know about the music publications and that pipeline. What was the Record World? Was that one? That's
Record
kind of
World was
bigger.
a trade publication. It was
Yeah, it
more
was
akin
bigger,
to
right?
Billboard.
Yeah, I mean, I know like Nelson wrote for them, and I think Vince Aletti wrote for them, but I don't know, like it didn't come up like East Village Other. I think it one impression I got from the voice people from the 70s, 80s, 90s is that they always kind of viewed the other publications with a little bit of a snobbery, you know, a little bit of a, oh, that's so cute. You're not the voice.
I think I
Also
think
because they're insecure,
yeah.
right?
I think a lot of the farm system thing with The Voice ended up being other alt weeklies in other cities. And it also was early in the 70s, it was Cream magazine. A lot of the
Yeah,
voice writers
yeah,
came from Cream.
yep, yep. I think that's probably one of the main beaters, right?
Well,
Chuck,
and then at some point also it's a lot of zines and
right, in the
people.
90s.
So you would read Rob Sheffield in a zine as much as you'd read him in Spin or The Village Voice.
Mhm.
Michael Barclay, would you like to ask your question?
Hello. Hi. I'm in Toronto, home of Bruce LeBruce. And thank you so much for this book. And I mean, I'm sure you've heard this a lot, but anyone who's ever worked in a similar publication anywhere in North America or elsewhere sees so much of themselves in this book.
Thank you.
I'm particularly fascinated with your viewpoint coming in to The Voice when you did. I think you really capture the cratering of the industry with the internet in the late 90s and the panic. That's totally fascinating and real, having been there. I think we all were. But as a Gen Xer, and you're writing about multiple decades, and we've already talked a bit about how you would have loved to write a whole book about the 80s. I loved reading about the 50s and 60s history of the Village Voice that I didn't know about, and the connections with Ed Koch and all the Stanley Crouch stuff. And so I'm just wondering how do you think the book would be different if it was written by somebody who was a staffer in the 60s or 70s? And what perspective do you think you brought to it, looking back on the years that you weren't there for?
Well, so I made a choice because there are two other books about The Voice. One is the greatest newspaper, and it goes all the way up until when Murdoch buys it. It ends there. And then the other one was Ellen Frankfurt's memoir, and that was in the mid-70s. So both of those books spent more time on the 50s and 60s, especially the 60s and 70s even, because that's when they were written and whatnot. And so I felt like I wanted to give more time to the 80s, 90s, and the 2000s were going to be the downfall of media and whatnot. And Bob is actually somebody who suggested, like, I don't know how you're gonna do this. This is, like, he's like, he basically said, like, there's just only so much that you can, cover, and maybe, not cover the 50s and 60s to the same degree. It was harder to cover the 50s and 60s to some degree because there's few people around that are still alive. Hentoff had already died, and he would have been great. There were people that I think if I had done the book 10 years earlier, I could have had more firsthand voices and not relied so much in that section on writing or other interviews. So I think that because I'm the age that I am, that we have the advantage of the long view, right? Being there at the very end and seeing because by the time we got there, would we hear like, oh, it used to be good back in the day. It was like, it's like when I started the book with, right? It was, that's when it was good. So, I knew that, like, also by the time I'm writing my column, I'm just a copy of a copy of a copy of Z Carr. I'm not doing anything new. All those people in the 60s and 70s are inventing a form and inventing and discovering a genre or a new artist, which by the time we get there in the 90s and 2000s, it's been done, not to say that there's not room for something new or whatever, but like that's kind of the challenge, right? I don't know if I answered your question.
That's the most Gen X answer possible, I think.
Let's throw the next question over to Carl. Oh, before we do, I should point out for just this very specific crowd who watches this series, there's a music book on just the early days of the voice music section by Devin Powers. That contrast between Richard Goldstein and Robert Christgau's approaches to music criticism. So if you are a PMBiP regular, I think that's a book for you. Carl, perhaps that will get you into your question.
Yeah, I didn't know about that book, and so in some ways it does. But I think my question is one of those things that if you had written interstitial bits might have gotten addressed more, but I felt like in the book it sort of remained a little fuzzy, which is kind of, if you had to sum it up, how would you say sort of among the original sort of important founding places of modern music criticism, between Cream and The Voice and Rolling Stone as kind of the biggies of that organs of the time. How would you say that Voice defined its approach, and what about that approach remains the most influential? And I guess as a sub question to that, how much was that defined by Bob's tastes, or how much was it the milieu and that kind of thing? So just your perspective on how that came together.
My opinion, well, from what I can see, John Wenner was very focused on celebrities and, his friends, and, we all know. Cream felt more like rough and, more, I guess, maybe blue collar or whatnot, more, loose. And The Voice, I feel like Bob's thing was to treat rock and roll as fine art, or literature, like the same way. And that meant deep thoughts, and long form and, connecting threads, and, not necessarily being in awe of the artist as a celebrity or, and, in some ways, like, one of the things that I think the voice music section got criticized for, especially later, I don't know if it was as true in the 70s and 80s, is that it was rock critics talking to each other and not necessarily to readers.
Yeah, obviously we all hate that here.
But that you could say was really true of pretty much every art section. depending on the writer. You know, you entered each of those sections with this. If you were writing for The Voice, you were working from the standpoint that the people that were reading you came to the table with like a deep amount of knowledge already and kind of could get your references. I mean, even my column was like the fact checkers hated fact checking my column because it was like a foreign fucking language to them. Like they were like, what? Who is this? The DJ night, there's the DJ night, there's the club night, there's the label name, and then there's the, you know, promoter. I mean, like, and they were all like weird names and,
Try doing
you
it
know,
for the
and
New Yorker.
yeah, yeah, I bet. So they hated it. But I was using shorthand because my column wasn't for the tourists that came in to visit for the weekend. It was for the people that like knew all the middle German techno that was coming out or were going to the clubs every week. And I think the music section at The Voice was the same. It wasn't directed at a general audience. If you were a general audience member and you got into it, then you were inducted into our, you know, group. That's how I mean, even like, and that made The Voice, that's why The Voice was The Voice. It wasn't necessarily, not everyone got it. And that's okay.
And I would add that it also had the quality of people who were writing for other people who knew the same stuff, but it wasn't identical to academics writing for other academics.
Right.
It was the
Slightly different,
strange, it was the strange other category of people steeped in a particular eclectic mix of cultural references. And some of them
Wordplay.
might have been academics and some of them might not, but that wasn't the key thing. The key thing was there was a common body of knowledge.
But I also think a lot of The Voice's writing was about literally like the language,
Mm-hmm.
the wordplay, the pun, you know, puns or not puns, or, you know, the stylistic choices that you made to stand out, or, you know what I mean? It was like, I don't know that that was true in most other like music publications quite the same way.
Oh,
Yeah,
definitely.
one of the 27 different things that killed the Village Voice was a redesign that made the print less incredibly imposing and important on the page.
Mm-hmm. 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 I
Um,
mean, I remember Bob was like, "This is the end. This is the end." He was so upset by that, because it was like every section had a lead, it had a sidebar, and then it had like a thing in the bottom, and then maybe you could have one jump, but like there was like a dictum. They dictated from the top down. I think Force was like getting feedback from the marketing department, something that didn't happen in 1970, to you know, to make the story shorter. That also went hand in hand with when the internet was um, coming up, where people were like, they don't want to read more than 1,500 words. So Don Force would be like,
yeah,
stories can't be longer than 1,500 words.
yeah. Alex VC, would you like to ask your question?
Sure. Hi, Tricia. Yeah, all the Bob talk is making me want to ask more questions about mentorship. In particular, how you sort of, if any
About
of your,
what?
about mentorship, how,
Mhm.
if any of the subjects talked about like cultivating talent, identifying talent, or that process of having their work vetted. I guess in particular, I'm interested in it in terms of possibly its gendered dynamics. And also maybe like the sort of intergenerational thing of like when you come up at The Voice, and then later when you are mentoring younger people when you've been there for a long time.
Um, so, huh. For me, the mentorship was through Frank Owen. And, you know, as much as we have a lot of like stories about older men being creepy with like the interns or whatever, he never was. He was always like, if he would always take me out to the clubs and introduce me to his sources and say, this is my colleague. And that was really special. Like, I think like a lot of people didn't get that. I can't say as a music writer, I don't know. There weren't a ton of women when I was there. I think Hilary Shute was there, came through, and I think Amy Phillips. And in general, I think the criticism world was male dominated in general, and that was true at The Voice too, with the exception of a few people like Anne and Evelyn, and there were a few women who were regulars, but I don't think they were. There just weren't as many women. I mean, like if you think of all the big critics at the film section, it's Hoberman, it's Saris, it's Minkus, Lisa Kennedy was there, Manola Dargis was there, Carrie Rickey was there, but Amy Taubman was there, but they kind of don't get mentioned quite the same. But I know that when I was talking to like the film ladies, like when Lisa Kennedy was the film editor, that she was really good about like working with Manola and working with Carrie Rickey and Amy Taubman, and working on stories, and kind of getting them to, write differently or, expand. The Voice was weird because it was both like free and alternative culture and whatnot, and also just as macho. Like I saw male colleagues of mine get promotions and get handed the reins for a big section, and they'd never edited anything in their life. And I had been a section editor for a couple of years, and part of that was just like John and Doug like those people. That's what happens. Yes, Carl, you're right. I was told not to look at the chat, but
Don't look at the chats.
All right, I'm gonna look at the chat now.
No.
But I think like when I was there, I had the opportunity to have some interns, and I always tried to bring them along, do the same thing that Frank did for me. And I had female interns, and one of them was Elizabeth Thompson, who's in the book at the end. And she came out clubbing with me, and she helped me with like a couple features, and she still like thanks me for that, even though I think that's just like the bare minimum, but yeah, I don't know if I answered your question, but
yeah, thank you.
Well, we are just about out of time. I did want to bring Chuck in one last time, just for all the years as music editor. Chuck, did you want to wrap us up, open and close the show? Talk about the tension between the national and local in The Voice.
Chuck, you there?
Chuck, you still there?
You gotta unmute. You have to unmute.
No?
No? Oh, wait. Can you unmute him? Can you ask
I can
to
try.
unmute?
Maybe you can't hear. Oh, well. That does happen to many veterans of the Village Voice music section. We lose our hearing.
I wonder if he is frozen, because it froze for me a few times.
Okay. It may
Oh, no, he's on Lelena's now.
Hi. Yeah, somehow I minimized the window and I couldn't figure out how to maximize it.
All right. So wrap us up. What's your question about the national?
Okay, my other question had to do with, and I think Tricia, you touched on this. You touched on this briefly. There's a tension, or kind of a dichotomy through history, about whether The Voice is a national publication or a New York publication. And I think that bears particularly on the Voice music section. I think obviously in the late 70s, early 80s, time of punk and disco and early hip hop and downtown minimalism, New York really was at the center of the universe. Right. But I was kind of wondering whether you had any thoughts about that. I'm also curious whether whether advertisers, I mean, I feel like there must have been a kind of a push and pull or an ebb and flow, like from editor to editor. Like some editors probably interpreted their role as to, to cover cover the music nationally, and others, zeroed in on more just on New York, or not just on New York, but more on New York. And I wonder if you noticed that at all, because I didn't know you did mention it to a certain extent in the book in general, although maybe not in regards to the music section.
I think
and whether to what extent local advertising might have played into that.
So I don't know about the advertising, except that when they came up with the idea for my column, like that had to do with that marketing survey where, Forrest was told, people want shorter, and we're getting too old. Like they found our average readership was like over 35, which was like considered ancient apparently to the voice advertisers and marketers. And so that's why they brought in me, and initially it was Jose Germosen to do the club column, and then Nick Tucci did the porn column. Can you hear me? Everybody else?
You're fine. Yeah, we can hear you.
So do you want me to repeat that, Chuck? Eric?
No. Did you have anything else you wanted to say in response to his question about the national versus local?
So I think there was, like, for instance, when the New Times came in after you left, they were more obsessed with it being a much more locally focused paper. Like they did not care.
On the ground reporting thing.
Yeah, that's what that was. And so whereas when you were there, I think it was more holistic. It was like if it was a local band that was good, you were going to cover it. If it was a national band that was good, you were going to cover it. It wasn't one versus the other, because I think at a certain point we were setting the agenda. The voice as a whole, the music section as a whole, was setting the agenda for what was the music for the national audience to pay attention to. Like I think like people forget, like we were the spotlight for a certain kind of music and certain kind of music fan, and we were like one of the only places that were doing those things. So we were the ones kind of saying this is what's the national thing going out, and that's, I think, true of New York media in general. Like I was in Seattle, and I remember thinking when I moved to New York, like waiting, so excited to see all these like local New York DJs that I had been reading about. And I thought, I was like, oh, they're not that good, or they're just as good as my Seattle DJs, but nobody knows my Seattle DJs because there's no media infrastructure to tell everybody about it. And I think like the Voice has always had, I go back, in the 60s, it was a local paper, right?
Right, but it was a neighborhood newspaper.
Yeah, it was a neighborhood paper. But the thing is, what was happening in New York was just the repercussions were so much bigger, right?
Well,
like
New York's always going to consider itself the center of the universe, whether it is or not.
But it really was then.
Sometimes it kind of is.
And not now, right? But it is definitely going to consider itself the center. But in the 70s also, like you had Marianne Partridge as the editor-in-chief, and she was much more about local New York. What is the New York of this? And then I think once you get to the 90s is when you start seeing alt weeklies, popping up around the country, and the Voice being treated as sort of like the nation's alt weekly versus just New York, is when you see that schism, right? And the music section was part of that. The 90s music section. Eric, you can talk about the 90s music section.
I certainly can. Well, I think we should wrap it up. All I would say about that last point is, in some ways, what may have been very good for the Voice music section might have been very bad for the Voice. So there might have been tension between being a national arbiter of taste and bringing in and feeling cliquish and outside and which led to the New York press trying to then seize that particular side. Lots more we could talk about. I want to point out that Abby Nolan, our former film section editor, asked the question of how much of the Voice music section is readily available to people looking to read it. And the truth is, damn little. So if another thing could be hoped for from some future collection, it would be a massive attempt to digitize and preserve what now lives either in pricey databases from the late 80s on or in almost impossible bound volumes in a small few libraries. So that would be a great thing to see. Tricia, thank you for a wonderful book and project. Michaelangelo,
Thank you.
thank you for the great questions and leading us through the process. For PMBiP fans, as noted at the beginning, October 29th, we return for another Voice alum, Ann Powers, with pal Allison Fensterstuck, talking about their great new NPR music collection, How Women Made Music, from the Turning the Table products. But for now, good night from PMBiP. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
All right, I'm going to stop recording.
Yeah.